For today, for our 15th year celebration, we have the esteemed poet and essayist Gerald Stern. He's the author of 16 books of poetry and the winner of several poetry achievements, including, just to name a few, the Frost Medal, the National Book Award, and the Wallace Stevens Award Medal. So it's a great privilege and an honor to have one of the most exceptional poets of our times here with us on our campus today. And after his reading, Mr. Stern will hold a question and answer session, and of course, you may purchase books. We ask that you silence your phones, both for the reading and question and answer, because as you can see, this is being filmed for the television. So thank you for joining us. Mr. Stern, sure,
First thing I have to do is silence my own phone. Several times I've given readings and interrupted myself with the ringing of the phone. And once I actually had a kind of brilliant conversation. I'm sorry that I'm limping a little bit, but when you reach my time of life, I'm in my third life now. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm going to silence my phone because it's sure to ring. In fact, somebody called me, but I'm going to ignore it. How do you do this? There we go. I was talking to Heidi and Tom over breakfast, a wonderful breakfast, about what kind of audience I would have today, what their background would be in poetry. Every reading you give is a challenge. And the audience is always different, and it's always a surprise. I'm always surprised when anybody has read poetry. We live in a culture, you know, and I needn't tell you about this since you live with me in the same culture, of total ignorance when it comes to poetry, almost total ignorance. And it's you know, I'm not complaining. I'm not up here to complain, just a little bit. But poetry is sort of ignored. It's honored in the breach, and when a new president comes in to be inaugurated, he or she always has someone reading a poem on the occasion. And when Trump becomes our president, I think, I don't know what kind of poet would come. I don't know anybody, except you know, poets are like other people. They love, and especially, they are worse in this than other, they love to be recognized. I remember once, years ago, I was at a bus stop in New York City, and somebody had pasted invitations to an event that was going to take place, and it was a group that was going to play a little quartet, musical quartet, and a poem of mine was pasted with it on the invitation. And I stuck around. I let the buses go to say to people, "That's a nice poem there. I wonder if you'd like to read it," you know? Poets love attention, partly because they get so little. And I guess accountants and lawyers don't really care for the attention they get. They are more attuned for the money they get, and that may be so. I mean, poets love money, like everybody else. And, you know, the standard thing we hear is you learn poetry, you're exposed to it for a little bit in elementary and middle school, and you forget about it by the time you get out of high school. Then you get to college, you study business administration or nursing, and poetry has very little to do with that. These are important things, particularly nursing. The poet goes on with his or her own life, And except for occasions when when he or she dies and gets a couple paragraphs, and if they're lucky in the New York Times, one never hears about them much. In Middle America, there are certain places where poets are well known, universities maybe. In fact, I think that's the only place, come to think of it. I mean, I suspect if I would spend all my time talking to you about what you know about poetry and which poems you know, I would be in unfamiliar ground, and I would learn that you didn't have a mother much, maybe most of you, or father, that read you poems when you were a kid. And you don't know what to expect. You're with me here. I don't know what to expect either. So I always prepare. I over-prepare for every reading. And if I had like 4 or 5 hours to talk to you about how to receive the language and the information that you are going to be bombarded with for 30 minutes, how to receive it, what to do, how your mind should digest and channel, and the information, the rhythm, the music, the misinformation, deliberate misinformation, the irony, the satire, playing with words. Heidi and I were just, there's a poem of mine she wanted me to read, but we didn't have a copy of it, so I couldn't read it. She had a copy she got offline, but there were some lines missing. And I was reading it, a little bit of it in the car. It was so weird. I wrote it many, many decades ago. I haven't seen the poem. It was finding my kidney on the road. And we're used to journalism. Journalists don't write about finding their kidneys on the road. Where is that poem? I'm just going to read a little. Do you have it with you? Just give it to me, okay? And I'm just going to. I'm not reading the poem. I'm just talking about a little bit about language. And thank you, Heidi. Just towards the end. Yeah.
Here's the kidney part on the last page.
So towards the end of the poem, I say, I'll just read this last paragraph or last stanza. I look at the wind, if you can look at the wind, and then I walk for 20 or 30 minutes so I can find my kidney on the road. I want to see it, weeping with pure self-pity, wringing its hands, the way a kidney wrings its hands, much better than the liver, much better than the heart, more sadness than either other organ. Now, I'm dealing with music and rhythm, either other. And, some critic would talk about the vowel coming before the consonant and so on. But these are things we just hear. We don't have to know the word consonant and vowel. We don't have to be schooled and educated that much in listening, as you don't when you listen to music. If I stand still, if you catch me just right, there is a cactus growing out of my shoulder, and my glasses, which I used to have, are falling as always. There is a look of wretched wisdom on my red face. Now, my face is red because I'm in the desert, and I'm writing about a desert sparrow. Maybe there will be a feather with little bits of white on the outer edge. I'll put in my left pocket. Maybe the stone that goes with the feather. Who says a stone goes with a feather? I say it. A tiny bit of pearl to hold it down. You must hold feathers down. And tiny bits of sand for the other pocket. Something to give me the desert again when I want it. The blazing sunlight for grief. A little shade for the sorrow. And that's the way the poem ends. And as I look at that, it's, full of crazy stuff. But that's what my poetry is composed about. Sometimes my poems are simple narratives, And, sometimes a poem is like a short story, which we delight in reading. Has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it evolves in a way that's familiar. And, but there are different kinds of short story writers. I mean, Chekhov is different than Hemingway. So I'm just going to start reading. My lesson for the day was to warn you of the way I deal with language, and you have to have all three ears alert to hear what's going on. And I don't always have resolutions, things you can take with you, except maybe some music. And that's finally what poetry is about, is its music. For poets are musicians. Some of them even play instruments. I was in junior high school. I come from Pittsburgh. I was given an instrument to play, the French horn. I had real thick lips. I couldn't make a sound come out of the French horn. So reluctantly, my teacher, Miss Steiner, gave me a trombone to play. And I played it loud. I loved the trombone. Until my neighbors in the apartment building, we lived and signed a petition. And I had and my musical career ended. So I'm just gonna, scatter around, read some poems from different books, and hoping some of them get to you. Let's see. I'm going to start with I've written a lot of poems about animals, and a book of essays came out of me a few weeks ago and said a third of my poems are about animals. I never knew that, but I'll accept it. This is about moles, and the poem is called Underground Dancing. In the winter, you put, maybe you do this at your house, bags of suet or fat in the trees for the dumb birds, because they eat constantly, pigs. There's a bird pecking at the fat. There's a dead tree covered with snow. There's a truck dropping cinders on the slippery highway. There's life in my backyard, black wings beating on the branches, greedy eyes watching, mouths screaming and fighting over the greasy ball. There's a mole singing, "Hallelujah! Close the rotten doors. Let everyone go blind. Let everyone be buried in his own litter." And I'll continue with just a couple poems. This is about 30 years work on this book. I give it about a few minutes. I'm gonna read a poem called Eggshell, which is a kind of elegy or a poem of mourning for a friend of mine, a poet, who died betimes. That is before they had his grave ready for him. Let's see, what page is that? 275. 275. And his name was Larry Levis. He was 49 when he died of an overdose. Lived in Maryland. Did he live in Maryland? No, in Virginia. Taught at the University of Richmond. So the poem is called Eggshell. One of the two great American poets, Whitman is one and Emily Dickinson is the other. And Emily Dickinson, talking about poetry, said, "Tell it slant. Tell it slant." That is, don't directly tell it. Don't say, "Larry Levis died yesterday," And I was walking down the street weeping and thinking if he'd only lived 10 more years, we were supposed to meet and have a beer. I mean, that's what you might say to your neighbor, but in a poem, you tell it slant. You talk about something else. It's called a metaphor. And then after a while, you realize through the music and the sadness of the language, if it's sad, that you're talking about a great poet who died before he should have. The color of life is an almost pale white robin's green that once was bluer when it was in the nest, before the jay deranged the straw and warm flesh was in the shell. I found it while doing my 45-minute walk between two doors beside some bushes and flowers. I put it in one of my pockets. I'm talking about the eggshell, huh? I put it in one of my pockets, keeping some space around it to protect the pale green. An idiot carrying a dead child inside him, something that might have broken out anyway, a blue afterbirth shoved out of the nest. I laid my dead like eggs on the table, 12 tombstones to a box. I buried dread that way, my telephone calls and letters, and on the way, I walked into a side yard and straightened a brick, for it was May, and chased a garter snake into his rain spout. And since it was morning and it was hot already, I put the eggshell under a leather chair and thought of our trip to New Orleans, and used the end of a broom to prop up a rose bush, the way we do, sweet Larry. And in honor of Larry, and this may seem like strange things to do, I propped up a rose bush with a broomstick. I remembered our trip to New Orleans together, and I put an eggshell under a leather chair. I chased a garter snake into his rain spout as if it were his home or her home. And I straightened a brick, the most important thing of all. I straightened a brick because the brick was crooked. And, of course, I straightened it because it was May. And that's when you straighten bricks. Why not? You'd never do it in January. And then one of the things that struck me as odd about the poem is that I made a box of eggs. And for some reason, they come in 12s. 12 eggs to a box, sometimes 6 eggs. Now I notice in some supermarkets 15 eggs to a box. But I called them tombstones, the eggs. 12 tombstones to a box. So there's some peculiar stuff happening here, which I like. I'm going to move on to another poem. I'm going to read a poem called The Dancing. And this poem is a kind of Holocaust poem. It starts off the history of this poem. It's a short poem, but it has a history. Even a worm has a history. Even a mayfly that lives for 10 minutes. So I was in a new place with a new job, freshly divorced, on my own, in a new house, and I had to buy some stuff, and I went into the Goodwill. I forgot that I was making a decent salary, and I remember buying a toaster. I was an old-fashioned toaster that folded up this way. I brought 2 pieces of bread with me into the Goodwill to make sure that the toaster worked. I wasn't going to spend $1. I was going to waste $1 on nothing. And while I was in that Goodwill, if it was a Goodwill or a Salvation Army or what, I noticed a radio It was a Philco brand that they made right after World War II, which we used to call the war. Now we have a permanent war. Guaranteed there'll always be one for the rest of your lives. There'll be a war. And somebody had a sign on the way in. What was it? Remember our troops, or our troops, or something like that. What did it say?
Support our children.
Oh, support our troops. And so they had there was a Philco radio. It was a very peculiar radio, and you put a record in it. You used to use records. You remember records? And the Philco would swallow the record, and the music would come on automatically. And I noticed this in this Goodwill. I bought that radio. It may have cost $8. And it reminded me of 1945, in the year the war ended, and somehow it moved into the Holocaust. So let me just read it. In all these rotten shops, in all this broken furniture and wrinkled ties and baseball trophies and coffee pots, I have never seen a post-war Philco with the automatic eye, nor heard Ravel's Bolero the way I did in 1945 in that tiny living room on Beechwood Boulevard, nor danced as I did then, my knives all flashing, my hair all streaming, my mother red with laughter, my father cupping his left hand under his armpit, doing the dance of old Ukraine, the sound of his skin, half drum, half fart. The world at last a meadow. The three of us whirling and singing, the three of us screaming and falling as if we were dying, as if we could never stop. In 1945, in Pittsburgh, beautiful, filthy Pittsburgh, home of the evil Mellons, 5,000 miles away from the other dancing in Poland and Germany. O God of mercy, O wild God. So if I were teaching that poem, if I were Heidi teaching it, I would say, what's the purpose of the last line? O God of mercy, O wild God. And I was interviewed by Bill Moyers about this poem. Bill Moyers, you know, raise your hand if you know who Bill Moyers is. Okay, a few people. He did interviews, but he was also LBJ's press secretary. He was a Methodist, came from Texas. He was puzzled by the last line. I'm writing about the dancing in Poland and Germany. What is that dancing? Well, you know, these are dead bodies being burned by the Germans, with a little help from the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians and the Russians, in places called Auschwitz and the like. And then I described God, oh God of mercy. That Bill Moyers could understand. But then when I said, oh wild God, he said, what do you mean, wild God? And I said to him, well, God was asleep, or maybe he was drunk, or was on a picnic, and he didn't pay attention. And it seemed sacrilegious to him, because he was raised as a simple Protestant in Texas. Brilliant man, Bill Moyers. And he couldn't understand how you could say wild God. But you know, in the death camps, people with their striped uniforms, starved, often put God on trial. They'd have formal trials. How could God bear that this could happen to them? So that explains, well, a little bit tempting to get into the issue of wild God, but I'll leave it go at that. And I'm going to change books. This one is called This Time, and it's Heidi's now. Here's a book called American Sonnets. I think this might be for sale out there. This is my favorite book of my own. I wrote it in 2000, something like that. I'm going to read maybe three poems from this book. Let me see what I'm going to read. Yeah. Okay, let me read a poem called Iris. I was living in a city called Easton, Pennsylvania. If you go west from New York on 78, Route 78, East-West Road, when you cross the Delaware River, the first city you come to is Easton, Pennsylvania, which was once a thriving industrial city, but now is a ruin. Well, it's sort of come back. There's some restaurants there. And I was living in an apartment there, and I described what happened to be at 2 in the morning. The lock was on the right, although I had to open it from the left so I could use my other hand to turn the knob. And there were 4 windows facing the street, and for a study, I put my feet on the painted board that covered the radiator. And that's where I slept for an hour since it was too exhausting to cross the room. And when I got up, I walked downstairs so I could sit in the square on one of the cold benches behind the limp flags, for it was 2 in the morning, and the prostitutes were making faces at the slow-moving cop cars and smoking cigarettes, the second-hand smoke of which I moved 2 benches away to escape, though I didn't say a word, nor did they ask me for anything more than a cigarette. And one of them gave me a flower. It was a faded blue iris, and it was cold that night. I put it inside my shirt so I could hurry home to adore it. And often these are things that really happen. Sometimes I make them up. And the person who's called I, who's speaking the poem, is sometimes literally me, or sometimes just a persona, a made-up figure, or a cross between the two of them. So sometimes it's I and sometimes it's me, or sometimes it's you. So let me read a poem here called Roses. And you know, roses are named for famous actresses and politicians and famous people. Some of the names I've made up. I don't even remember which are real and which are made up. There was a rose called Guy de Maupassant, a carmine pink that smelled like a Granny Smith. And there was another from the 17th century that wept too much and wilted when you looked, and one that caused tuberculosis. Doctors dug them up. They wore white masks and posted warnings in the windows. One wet day it started to hail, and pellets the size of snowballs fell on the roses. It's hard for me to look at a Duchess of Windsor. It was worn by Franco and Mussolini at Stade Jews. Yesterday I bought 6 roses from a Haitian on Lower Broadway. He wrapped them in blue tissue paper. It was starting to snow, and both of us had on the wrong shoes. Though it was wind, he said, not snow, that ruined roses, and all you had to do was hold them against your chest. He had a ring on his pinky the size of a grape, and half his teeth were gone. So I loved him and spoke to him in false Creole, for which he hugged me and enveloped me in his camel hair coat with most of the buttons missing. And we were brothers for life. We swore it in French. I don't remember whether, I think it actually happened that I did meet a Haitian on Broadway, and we did speak a little French to each other. I know they usually speak Creole. Most Haitians don't really speak French. And I'll read one more poem from this book, if I can find it. It's called Box of Cigars. I tried either one or two, that's to say the cigars, but they were stale and broke like sticks or crumbled when I rolled them, and lighting a match was useless, nor could I put them back in the refrigerator. It was too late for that. Even licking them filled my mouth with ground-up outer leaf, product of Lancaster or Eastern Virginia. So schooled I am with cigars. It comes in the blood, and I threw handfuls of them into the street from 3 floors up, and to my horror, sitting on my stoop were 4 or 5 street people who ran to catch them as if they were suddenly rich. And I apologize for that. No one should be degraded that way. My hands were crazy, and I ran down to explain, but they were smoking already. Nor did I have anything to give them since we were living on beans ourselves. I sat and smoked too, and once in a while we looked up at the open window, and one of us spit into his empty can. We were visionaries. So how we doing on time? We're okay? Yes. I don't remember what time I started. Let's see, sometime during the day still. Read a few poems from this book. How many here have ever been to Camden, New Jersey? Can you hear me now? Camden, New Jersey, and there's a poem I want to read about Camden if I can find it. Can't remember what the title of it was. You know, is one of the most horrible cities, they say. I sort of love it even as it is. Wish I could remember the name of that poem. Maybe I won't find it. Give me a second. Oh, here it is, Broken Glass. And it has about 70% unemployment. And it's in bad shape. Walt Whitman, the last house he lived in, the last place he lived in his life was Camden, New Jersey, one of a very live city. And when there were ferries that went across from Camden to Philadelphia. And there's a house in Camden that Whitman lived in. So, let me just read the poem. The name of the street he lived on was Mickle Street. Mickle, as in nickel. Broken bottles brought him to Mickle Street, and pieces of glass embedded in the mud, to Whitman's wooden house across the street from the church of the most unhappy Redeemer. For when it was too quiet, he broke another bottle, and he collected his glass in a paper bag. And when he was forlorn, which means lost in German, and when he was forlorn, he cut himself, though just as like he cut himself on a wall while doing an exercise to stretch the tendons so he could get rid of the numb and burning feeling. Or sometimes he sat on a hydrant, and once on a bench with drooping slats, so when the slats gave, his back also gave, and feeling came back to his foot as it came back to Whitman when he sat on the orange rush seats or rocked in his chair between the visits and loved the hollyhocks that grew in the cracks. And for a nickel, the whole republic would turn to broken glass, as Oscar insisted. Now, Oscar is Oscar Wilde. And believe it or not, Whitman was rediscovered by the English writers in the last years of the 19th and the first years of the 20th century, and they came to visit him. And Oscar Wilde was one of the people. Maybe you don't know who Oscar Wilde is. That's a problem. So you should read The Ballad of Reading Jail. Um, and of course, you know, I know that Oscar Wilde visited him, but I don't know if Oscar Wilde said, for a nickel, the whole republic, meaning America, would turn to broken glass, whether he said that or not. He probably did. Anyhow, something to think about. Well, there's a wonderful museum in New York. Any of you ever been to New York? Anyone's ever been to the Frick Museum? Okay, the Frick Museum is named for Mr. Frick, whom I hate. He was the partner of Mr. Carnegie, whom I equally hate, because they both were from Pittsburgh, where I was from. And they owned the steel mills, and they locked out the workers and starved them and underpaid them and cut their pay and so on, and they gave them death benefits. And they had a strict system. If a person was a Slovak, he got so much. If he was Polish, he got so much, depending on how many years he worked, $10, $50. So the paintings, these great paintings that Frick accumulated and sculpture in the mansion itself, 40, 50 rooms, was paid for by the blood of Eastern and Southern workers who worked U.S. Steel, Jones and Laughlin, Carnegie, Illinois, and all the other steel mills in Pittsburgh. It's called Greed Incorporated. It's what runs this country, and it's what Trump believes in. Keep it in mind. If you go to vote Republican, God save you if you do. The Frick Mansion, figuring up what you might call an exchange and only for a painting, but not counting the claim of a share in the 60 rooms, or counting a share of the inflation compared to the mean reduction of so many bodies in such a heavy cardboard box or two, I'd say 350 to 750, taking in a complicated system of matching death payments with the cost of buying or stealing. Or I'd say 300 dead Slovaks for one Caravaggio. What do you think? At least you understand what that poem's about. It's a little angry, isn't it? You're allowed to be angry if you're a poet? Yes. You're allowed to be angry even if you're not a poet. Let me see if I can find one more poem from this book. Okay, there's a poem here called Plaster Pig, page 107. And as you know, people from the Near East, not just Jews and Muslims, I guess Seventh-day Adventists too, for all I know, are not allowed to eat pig. Raise your hands if you know that. Okay. And there's all kinds of theories about why that's so. Why does Leviticus say that you can't eat pig meat, or also you can't eat snails and so on? And then people say later, oh, it's for health because you can get trichinosis. Well, you can get diabetes from eating too much of cow flesh. So, I mean, that can't be the reason. So nobody really knows. So I explain it all in this poem. It's called Plaster Pig. In my living room in Lambertville, New Jersey, my wife and her son, Jeremy, brought me a little gift one day, a little pig made of plaster. And I have a rooster in the room. It's like a farmyard, my living room. It's called Plaster Pig. It didn't work that the boars I grew up with smeared my door with lard, for I was enlightened and walked with the rest in the mountains of Italy on Easter morning and went to St. John's on Christmas Eve. And neither does anyone I know keep a plaster pig in his living room, for it is not what goes into the snout, and of course that's a paraphrase of what Jesus said, is not what goes into the mouth, but what comes out of the mouth, and so on and so on. And you will forgive me, whether you like it or not, for wasn't being afraid of the pig that drove us there in the first place? And wasn't it God in the second? And it had bristles in the third? And the lungs were too small? And it was as smart as a fox terrier and lived in shit? And it turns wild in a second like nothing else. And someone once told me the male has a cock that twists around like a corkscrew. And for those reasons, I won't eat it. This book is called Divine Nothingness. It's my last published book. A couple of poems from here, and then I'll read two recent poems of a new manuscript. It's going to be out January of 2017. Let's see. Page 29. I wonder what that poem is. It's for D, whoever D is. No, I'm not going to read that one. Okay, I'm going to read a poem called Not Me. Not Me. Page 51. It wasn't me, but someone else in his 80s sitting against a wall, and it had to be his mother sitting beside him, well over 100, and maybe blind, I couldn't tell, and feeding her from a tin plate, or maybe it was foil of some kind. I don't remember. And when a small girl, maybe 3 or 4, came by in tan stockings with horizontal blue stripes and new blue shoes and sunglasses, I remember, it could have been Crete, Heraclean, I'm sure of it. He stared in disbelief, maybe in envy, maybe even in joy, and turned to his mother to whisper something, and folded his stiff fingers over his belly, and broke out into a smile, and half closed his eyes and almost nodded. There were so many decades between them. He could have slapped the ground with gratitude. Okay, I'll read a poem called What Brings Me Here. How many know where Lambertville is? So, my wife and I, for when we got together, she had 3 small children, who are no longer small children. That was 18 years ago. And I didn't want to. I've already raised hundreds of children, so I kept my house. I was there first, and she had a separate house, and we'd eat supper, and I'd sleep in her house, and then in the morning I'd go to my house, and she's a poet too, an excellent poet. She read here last year, Anne Marie McCary. And why did I bring that up? Oh, on my way walking from my house to her house at supper time, I would pass a certain church, a Methodist church, that had a bench in front of it. And I've written, for some reason, several poems about this building. And this one is called What Brings Me Here. Here I am again. And what brings me here to the same wooden bench, preaching to the city of Lambertville, surrounded by Mayapples. For who in the hell is going to lie down with whom in the hell, either inside or outside? You remember Isaiah said, the lamb will lie down with the lion, huh? For who in the hell is going to lie down with whom in the hell, either inside or outside? And you know, it's amazing to watch flies lie down with feces, or mosquitoes lie down with blue bloods. And over there is a double house, you call it twin. And when the one on the right burned down in under a minute, the one on the left refused to budge, not even an inch. I'm not saying a French horn with a trombone, or a fleabane with a fleabane, or in one case, wood is fuel with wood as a god. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter grinding the faces of the poor, or whether it's a song or not, even if someone got carried away and swam across the East River to Little Poland, even if someone called himself a remnant and lay there for sale cheap in the cheapo bin, whose grandfather had a trumpet for an ear and raged against the heartless, then lost his polished head lying down with the sycamores. The great poet William Carlos Williams, who also came from New Jersey, northern New Jersey, wrote a poem called Tract. And this poem, he starts off, I will teach you, my townspeople, how to perform a funeral. You should walk, I'm paraphrasing it. Don't take carriages, don't drive in Cadillacs and so on, but walk as they do in France and so on. It's called Tract. So this poem is called Tract. And it recalls my early adolescence when I was very rebellious. And I remember a Friday night dinner. My mother had put up a fresh tablecloth, and my immigrant parents were as stupid as usual. And I, as usual, because it's a supper table where you get into arguments, argued whatever it was, racism or this or that. And I got very angry, and something I think about a lot in remorse and to apologize, I pulled the tablecloth off, and the gravy boat overturned and spilled gravy over the whole table. And it's a memory I have. I was about to throw a chair at my mother when as I decided it was much better to spill gravy on her tablecloth. But the only way I knew how to do it was to dismantle everything, which is why I pulled the cloth from under the chicken. And for this reason, I will walk to my own grave weeping at the back of my coffin, as WCW advises. And just one short more poem for here. 102. It's a memory of Johnny Cash. It has a phrase, but do you know, how many raise your hands? Raise your hands if you know the music of Leonard Cohen. And I call him in this book Learned Cohen. And I remember the person who worked with me in correcting my, says, you mean Leonard Cohen, not Learned Cohen. I said, no, I mean Learned Cohen. He who has a forehead will have a forehead still. And she who has a little brown egg will have her nest and give her milk in the most unlikely place of all. And Johnny Cash will sit with his hand on one leg and his other hand holding his head up, and Leonard Cohen will get on his knees before his brilliant violinist, and he who is filthy will be filthy still. And most of all, Thelonious Monk will turn around again and again, a different tick from mine, but equally respectable. Do you know Thelonious Monk's music? Raise your hand if you do know it. One of my favorite musicians, and he had a tick. He would turn around. You ever see him? How many of you have ever seen him perform? You wouldn't, not likely, but I used to see him on 52nd Street. And he would literally, physically turn around as he played the piano. He was a marvelous performer. Okay, I'm going to return and read the last poem in this book. First, let me read just two recent poems, if I can find them. And then I'll free you of, then we'll talk a little bit. Let me pick out couple of poems from here. Okay, I'm going to read a poem called Perish the Day, which comes from Job. Perish the day on which I was born. Have you read Job? Raise your hands if you have. Good, terrific. Okay, this is a strange poem. I like it, and I don't know why. 27. And it's another poem about Larry Levis, I realize it. It's not just Larry who keeps going to meetings when there's no one there. I went to one in the latrine where a body was hanging from a pipe and a finger had written in vapor, "Just a warning." But whoever dragged him in forgot to take his boots off before or after, and there was only one person there, one live person, and he was cleaning the toilet with Ajax, the magic cleanser. And he had an Irish accent mixed with English, I myself heard in Scotland. So that makes two, and in walks Larry, and then for an hour or more, he and Jonathan Swift, the Ajax man, talked horses. They were both interested in horses. And as Larry said, an angel disguised as a fly flew into the ear, then into the brain of the horse. You should watch where you put the swab, and you should scratch the smooth skin closest to the skull, so your hand can slip onto the horse's head, which he would shake free and move along the fence so he could bend down for new weed. And as for the meeting, it lasted just long enough to cut the dead man down and wash him off. It was hard getting the boots off without cutting or snipping, for there were no laces. That's what I want to say. There were no laces on the day we unhanged him. I remember struggling with that word. I made it up. I guess it's in the dictionary, unhanged. I mean, I didn't want to make it wordy when we took him down from where he was hanging, and I called it unhanged. So let me end up with this little poem I said I would. There's some great poems in here, really. One about Orson Welles, hands. And I met Orson Welles in France, where he was self-exiled during the McCarthy period of American fascism. And I was with a friend of mine, and we wandered into his little church, where he was putting on, had a stage production of, they were preparing for a production of Macbeth. And he asked who we were, and we went out for drinks, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, let me see what kind of poem I'm going to read here. All right, I'm going to read two short ones and then this one. This is called My Grave. No, I'm just going to read two poems. One called Skylark, and then one more. Skylark. Do you know? Raise your hands if you know Skylark. It's a song. Skylark, da 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 da. La da 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 da. La da 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 da. Da 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 da. Skylark. And here we go. Instead of reading that, I'm going to read a book called Fall 1960. And it was in the fall. I think I may have forgotten the exact progression, the dates and such. But Fidel Castro came to the United Nations in the early days of the Kennedy administration. And they rented a hotel in Harlem. And it was called the Teresa. And they brought their own chickens with them because they didn't want to be poisoned by the capitalists. And that, I think that was the year, I may be mistaken, where Khrushchev, the premier of Russia, at a meeting of the United Nations, banged his shoe in protest. How many? Raise your hands if you know about that. So I make a little of it up. But it ends up with, the poem ends up with a radio show that I, as a boy then, used to hear for 15 minutes. They had every afternoon 15-minute programs. Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon. They had one called Jack Armstrong. Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy. Castro himself, you wouldn't believe it, ate Wheaties for breakfast. In his hotel in Harlem, I remember it was a Teresa, and they cooked chickens in the kitchen they brought over from Cuba, for they were afraid John Foster Dulles or his brother Alan Dulles might poison them. And Khrushchev took off his heavy black shoe and turned on the radio at 4:45 to hear the latest adventure of Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy, and I even stopped kissing my close friend's wife while he was in the bathtub, soaking, drunk, and singing songs from the islands off Messina. He who worked for the Quakers and was fired for drinking and singing, though soaking was acceptable. Here is the song. We, the Piper Hudson High boys, show them how we stand. Never tired of Wheaties, the best food in the land. So won't you try Wheaties, the best breakfast food in the land. That was Jack Armstrong. And I'm just going to read this short poem, which I promised you, if I can find it. I love Jack Armstrong. It's called Life Watch. Good to lie down in a yard of shadowing bimbo trees, against a dying redbud near a Japanese maple, whose deliquescent branches, year by year, it gets darker and darker. Good to be near a fence, which, unlike its neighbors, both up and down, it's all of wire, a see-through chain link, different from the wooden walls, the jails nearby, the swimming pools, and sling chairs. Good to be here finally, filling in the gaps, and drinking coconut milk again, and out of debt forever. Thank you.